In the year 1991, the Super Nintendo was released in North America, and it took the country, and consequently the world, by storm. A huge step up from the NES, the SNES was capable of doing so much more than its younger brother, and with it brought alongside many innovative games and ideas that have come to be staples to this day. With this system, RPGs were also on the rise, and there was no end in sight to either the RPG or the platformer, with platformers as a whole dominating the system. Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Earthbound were also fantastic RPGs in their own right, and they hailed in a new era for the standard of the modern-day RPG in the West. Despite all of these bright gems, however, there was one game that was very revolutionary for its time, and though not rare or obscure, it's a game that is definitely hidden in plain sight. That game is ActRaiser. Released on the Super Famicom in Japan on December 16, 1990, and in the States in November of 1992, ActRaiser wasn't quite a launch title for the system, but it was released extremely early in the system's lifespan. ActRaiser is a curious little game that is half action platformer and half life sim, with a couple small RPG elements thrown in for good measure. You play as the Master, who awakens after a long sleep after his defeat at the hands of the evil Tanzra. During your slumber, you find that Tanzra has taken over the world and split the world between his 6 lieutenants, and it's your job to play God and take back what was once yours. That's probably the first thing you'll notice about ActRaiser is the religious connotations that abound in the game. See, back in the day, for those unaware, Nintendo had an extremely strict policy regarding what could be in a Nintendo game in the US. ActRaiser became the poster child for this policy because the attempts at hiding the religious context is almost sad, as it was terribly obvious even to 4-year-old me that this game had you playing as a deity of some sort. In fact, Master and Tanzra in the Japanese release are referred to as God and Satan respectively anyways, although I always found the name Tanzra to be a pretty cool alternative name. One of the cool things about ActRaiser is how it tells its story. There isn't necessarily character development in the plot, but there are still twists for each area you visit that keep things interesting. The story is told by the little naked cherub you control in your interactions with the villagers in whatever town you're currently rebuilding. What's surprising about this is how absolutely solid the writing in this game is, and how it's able to cover its religious context so well. In all honesty, this game is extremely mature in its writing, and it was very clear that a lot of love went into writing it. And yet, despite the nature of the script, it manages to not be contrived and covers some very interesting ideas, such as if your followers were to rebel against you for a new god, or whether or not you as God should yearn for your people to be so independent that they no longer need you. The game asks questions, and yet manages to stay simple enough that everyone can enjoy its story, and maybe even relate to it in some ways. Gameplay in ActRaiser is actually really cool, and to this day, remains the only game of its kind that I'm really aware of. You start by moving your massive temple over an area and going to war with Tanzra's minions of said area. This is the Act 1 area, where your objective is to play a side-scrolling level and get to the end and beat the boss. The stages in the game are all very well done, and each one has its own unique flavor, enemies, and challenges. Very few concepts are recycled, and when they are, they're modified to be a little bit different. The very first stage has trees that will move about to the sides when you jump on them, for example. They move in such a way that doesn't feel super unfair, and it's clear that they were designed with the jumping mechanics in mind. A later level has you going upwards by jumping on bubbles which pop after a certain amount of time passes while you're standing on them. But they're all placed in such a way that works with the mechanics, so although they're stage gimmicks, they all feel unique and are a fun challenge and really don't feel unfair. Sounds like a stupid thing to bring up, like, duh, right? Well, back in the day, there were many platformers which had a ton of unfair gimmicks and mechanics that really felt like they're just working against you. Having a game like this, which is fair but challenging, is surprisingly unusual for its time, as games were intentionally designed to be difficult since they were pretty short anyways, and once you beat them, you're probably not gonna want to play them again anyways. At the end of each level, you'll face that X-boss, and all of the bosses are unique, with their own attacks and tactics that you need to fight them. Most of them have very simple patterns, and in truth aren't terribly difficult to beat, and you probably won't even really need a couple of attempts, to be honest. But what I really enjoy about these bosses are their designs, and all of them are actually pretty scary looking and intimidating, and it feels like fighting them is a grand and possibly even, if I may say so, an epic encounter with a tough enemy. Except this guy. He's not intimidating at all. Once you've completed Act 1 of an area, you'll unlock the sim portion of the game, and it's here that the game really becomes unique. You play as the nameless adorable cherub, and your job is to guide your little people to rebuild their homes and increase the population of whatever area you're in. But the minions of Tanzer aren't going to let you rest easily, and they'll be attacking your villagers as well as your cherub to try and stop you. Or just be a mild annoyance at worst, since you can't actually die in these sections. If you're out of HP, you can't attack with your Bow of Justice, and that's not really a big issue since you just regenerate HP over time. Each of these minions are being spawned from lairs, and you'll need to guide your little followers to those lairs so they can seal them and stop them from being annoyances. But you won't just fight minions, you'll also have to combat the local trees and shrubs, too. As the cherub, you have various spells you can use that clear a path, such as lightning to destroy the bushes, or sunlight to get rid of the heavy marsh. While all of the spells have their uses, the only really useless one is honestly wind. You have to use wind once, otherwise it really just clears all enemies on screen. But killing an enemy with your bow restores your SP, which is what you use to cast spells, so it's not really useful at all. Sometimes when you clear out a lair, your followers will find items such as power-ups for your cherub to dish out the damage, or a new spell for Master to use during the action stages. Heck, you can even find 1-ups that grant a permanent extra life as well, which is always a welcome addition. As you build more houses and create more minions, or followers, your level will increase. Population is the equivalent to experience points in this game, which I always thought was a cool little detail. Gaining a level doesn't increase your attack, but it does give you 1 extra hit point for the cherub and the master, and it gives you more SP so you can use your cherub's spells more often. Since you're not restricted by stats like attack and what have you, this means leveling isn't terribly important unless you find you're not doing so on the action stages, and if you really can't beat an Act 2 of an area, you can try and complete an Act 1 of another area and amass population from there too. There's a surprising amount of options available to you, and in some ways the game feels very non-linear in the way everything is handled. The presentation of ActRaiser is extremely clean and sharp. It won't win any awards for graphics, but this is also an early SNES game, so you kinda expect that. But despite that, the game really shines in the artistic direction. The enemies are all well designed, they're easy to spot, and don't blend in with the background. For that matter, the game's environments make it very clear what is a platform and what isn't, a very common issue in platformers even to this day. There's lots of vibrant colors and the game is very, well, colorful, while at the same time the art is also a bit macabre, and it gives off a feeling of despair, but never so much that it's too overwhelming. It strikes a perfect balance between the two, as there's even a slight feeling of dread in some of these stages, which I find very impressive for a platformer, especially in this era. A lot of the enemies are very much designed in the veins of being demonic, but the designs are all so unique that it never feels stale. You may run into the occasional recycled enemy, but each one has their own personality and quirk that it ultimately makes the game feel really fresh. The environments themselves are also extremely well detailed, with every act having its own personality and feel to it, and it's clear that a ton of effort went into the stage design of the action stages. Plus, I swear that Act 1 of Cassandor looks like a planet from Star Wars, but I could be mistaken. It doesn't help the last boss is a giant antlion either. There isn't much to the game's animations, however, and most animations tend to be relatively weak, as there isn't much to them. But they're there, and they get the job done. And I think that's probably the weakest aspect of this game. If you check out their sprite sheets, most enemies have maybe 5 frames if they're lucky. However, it would not be an ActRaiser video if I didn't bring up the game's soundtrack, and dang is it really good. The soundtrack was composed by Yuzo Koshiro, and it stands out as one of the most bombastic and unique soundtracks of the era. Most songs tend to be, well, bombastic in tone, with the Fillmore song taking the spotlight as the most well-known. That shouldn't undermine the rest of the songs, however, as this may be one of the only soundtracks where I enjoy every single song. Some are very slow and melancholy, and some are very dark and dreary, but with just enough life to them that they don't just stay in the background. Birth of the People will undoubtedly get stuck in your head, mostly because you'll hear it every single time you're doing sim stuff. There's even an incredibly sad song called Sacrifices, which, for me, was the very first time I'd ever really heard a depressing track. Even if you don't play the game, I still very much recommend giving the OST a listen on YouTube. A strong musical score was paramount in the early days of gaming, else you were left with just listening to the same repetitious sound effects over and over and over, and it's clear here that Koshiro is extremely talented in his field. In fact, he mentioned that this very soundtrack was the first time he'd ever composed something for the SNES on a Yamaha FM sound system. Koshiro also stated that this was one of the first games he had tried to bring a more classical feel to, and it very much shows in the stylistic choice of the music. In fact, I wonder if there had been other classic music-inspired soundtracks before this one in games. Interestingly, ActRaiser has a lot of regional differences associated with it, as it has been modified and changed in every region in some drastic ways. I mentioned earlier that the game's imagery and plot was modified heavily for a North American release due to strict policies, and while that's true, there were far more changes than that. Not only were most of the graphics, which could be construed as even slightly religious, replaced or removed, many enemies had sprite changes or even had attacks straight up removed. In fact, the Japanese version of the game is pretty difficult, and there are lots of little changes that add up to the Japanese version being a completely different experience altogether, outside of just the plot. First, the text box in the Japanese version is a lot smaller and compact, and feels much more like a traditional RPG. This is because you can convey a lot more in Japanese with fewer characters than you could in English. Roughly a third of the enemies in the game are either reskinned or have attacks not present in the North American version, and some have attacks that can do 2 or more damage, whereas in the main game of the North American version, most attacks do 1 damage, with a couple rare exceptions and not counting professional mode. The layout and difficulty of some bosses have been changed too, with the Minotaur boss of Fillmore Act 2's speed being faster in the Japanese release. This makes the fight quite a bit more difficult, especially early on. Or, in Bloodpool Act 1, the platforms you can jump across are arranged differently, and placed in such a way that you have to be very aggressive to even stand a fighting chance against him. And that's because the amount of time you have to complete each level is reduced by an entire 100 seconds in each level. In my attempts in the Japanese version, I actually lost a life due to running out of time in Bloodpool, and I've never died in ActRaiser due to running out of time. There's also a difference in the Sims part too, since your HP is constantly refilling in the Japanese version, but your HP only recovers when your followers attempt to build houses somewhere. Your SP also recovers over time in the North American version, but the only way to recover SP in the Japanese version is to kill enemies. And if that weren't enough, the SP cost of spells were changed too. Earthquake costs 160 SP in the North American version, but only 60 in the Japanese version. So in some ways, the North American Sims portions are easier, and in some ways they also aren't. But I'd say that the changes for the North American version were for the better. As if that weren't enough, the European release had a slew of crazy changes to it as well. Using the North American version as a base, the game now has a choice of 3 different difficulties upon starting a new game. There's Beginner, Normal, and Expert, with Normal being the equivalent of Professional mode in the North American version, and Expert being its own difficulty in itself. And trust me, Expert mode on European ActRaiser is insanely difficult, with some enemies doing a whopping 4 damage to you per hit. However, you have access to Professional mode from the start in the European version, whereas you have to unlock it in the North American version by beating the game, and each of the difficulties from the main game can be selected for the action stages. However, unlike in the Japanese and North American Professional modes, you don't actually have maximum HP when you're playing these levels. Instead, you have to find permanent HP increases in one of the power-up icons hidden throughout the levels. And if that weren't enough, you can even find magic power-ups that you couldn't normally use in certain stages, and it can be stored for later use on bosses or a rough part of the stage if you really want. With these difficulties, the hardest version of the game is undoubtedly the European version, with its Expert mode, as some of the enemy changes that were omitted in the North American release are added back, plus having to gain HP power-ups in these levels since you already have max HP for the North American version. And if that wasn't enough information for you, there is even an arcade version of ActRaiser and a mobile phone version. The arcade version isn't ActRaiser on its own, sadly, as it's included in the Nintendo Super System, which, as you might guess, has a bunch of various games on it. And actually, I think I recall seeing ActRaiser played in the old game show Nick Arcade, or at least being an option there. I can't say for a fact, but I'm going to guess that the version that was on there was probably the Super System version. This version really just has a different scoring system, and it's just the action stages. The mobile phone version is nothing special either, it's just the first 4 action stages. I tried to see if this version was still available, but all I could find were shady sites at best, and I really didn't want to risk finding out if they were legit or not. ActRaiser is and always will be my favorite game of all time. No matter how much I look at or to play it, I have such a difficult time finding problems with the game. I'm not one of those people who gets so blinded by nostalgia that I refuse to acknowledge a game's faults, but I really do think ActRaiser is nearly perfect. It's probably nostalgia since this was the first game I've ever played, but even still I just can't find problems. Yeah, the animations are minimal, and there's a bug that prevents you from getting the maximum level unless you do an incredibly specific route for your people, but honestly, that's not even as big of a deal as it sounds. You could say it's too simple, since the action stages are very basic and the sim portions don't have too much to them, but that's precisely why they're so good. In their simplicity, they create an extremely fun and, well, simple experience. I personally believe not everything has to have super crazy depth to be enjoyable, and ActRaiser manages to find that perfect balance. It makes the game approachable without insulting your intelligence and skill, and that's why I love it so much. On a more personal level, I owe ActRaiser so much. It taught me when I was a kid what video games are capable of, how games can tell stories through interactivity, how music is such a powerful force, how games can be fun even if they're simple. I remember my older sister and mom used to play this game all the time, and I was so enamored by it that it was always my fallback game among our collection of SNES games. Sure, I'd play Street Fighter 2 or Gradius 3 or even Yoshi's Island, but ActRaiser was a game that was a reliable form of enjoyment for me. I made it a point to play it at least once every year, and it single-handedly created the passion and love that I have for games. And for that, it isn't a stretch to say that without this game, I wouldn't be the person I am today. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video on ActRaiser, and hopefully you enjoyed it. This is the first time I've ever made any kind of video like this at all, and I'm scratching at my nose, so now I just realized the audio is going to be kind of weird. So, I've never done an end slate before either, so this is all new to me, and I don't really quite know what to say, because this isn't scripted at all. Should you even script end slates? Because I feel like they're more entertaining if they're just kind of things that I say. Because, you know, professionalism, yay! Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed that video. I realize ActRaiser is kind of a more commonly done video, but it's also my favorite video game of all time, so I figured it'd be a really good start for this channel. Let's see. Oh yeah, if you would like to, I strongly recommend subscribing to my friend Johnny Nitpick, who was the major inspiration and the person who gave me the confidence to make videos like this, because without him, I probably never would have made videos like this. So hopefully somewhere in the video, pointing to my screen, like you can see my hand pointing to the screen. You can click on a link and you can check out his channel. His videos are more skit comedy and not like mine at all, but you know, his videos are good. Go check him out. Why do I sound awkward in an end slate? This is not normal. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed, and let me know what you guys thought of the video, what you think of ActRaiser, whether or not you like ActRaiser, whatever you feel like in the comments. And as always, thank you guys so very much for watching. What? This isn't a Let's Play channel. What am I doing?